Imagine working an entire 8-hour shift and receiving a paycheck for $17.04. Not a mistake, not a bad day. That's what federal law still allows restaurants to pay some workers in America. Now here's the part that should bother you. That number, $2.13 an hour, has not changed since 1991. Gas was $1.14 a gallon back then. The internet didn't exist yet for normal people. And somehow, this one number just stopped. Everything else moved. Rent moved, groceries moved, phones, cars, houses, all of it moved. This number stayed exactly where it was for 35 years. That should be impossible. Numbers don't just stop moving on their own. So something stopped it. Here's how big this actually is. Right now, somewhere between 15 and 19 states still use this exact $2.13 rate. Not as an exception, as the law. And here's the strange contradiction sitting right next to it. In 2020, less than half of digital payments even asked you for a tip. By 2023, that number was almost 75%. Tip prompts are now everywhere. Self-checkout, airport kiosks, coffee counters where you ring up your own order. So picture both of these facts at the same time. The wage businesses are legally required to pay hasn't moved in 35 years. But the amount they're asking you, the customer, to chip in has been exploding. That's not a coincidence. That's a transfer. And to understand how it works, you have to clear up something almost everyone gets wrong first. You've probably heard TIP stands for To Ensure Prompt Service. It doesn't. Acronyms as a way to make words are basically a 20th century thing. But the word tip goes back to the early 1600s. There's also a logic problem. You tip after the service. Insurance is paid before. The order doesn't even make sense. The real origin, according to the Oxford English Dictionary, comes from old slang meaning to hand something over secretly. The same root that gives us a tip, as in insider information. So the word was never about guaranteeing quality. It was always about something quietly changing hands, which is exactly what was about to happen on a massive scale. Go back about 400 years to Tudor England. Wealthy guests staying at a friend's house would give money directly to that friend's servants. This payment was called a vail. Simple idea. The guest is creating extra work, so the guest pays for it. But watch what happens next. The servants start expecting it, then demanding it. By the 1700s, British royalty were complaining that visiting friends had become expensive because the staff expected payment on top of everything else. Some staff reportedly threatened guests who refused. A nice gesture became a requirement, and refusing it became socially impossible. Now fast forward to English coffee houses in the 1600s. Samuel Pepys, in his diary, mentions tipping as far back as 1668. By 1782, someone complained that tips once given freely, with a low bow, were now imperiously demanded as a right. Read that again. That's not a quote about modern tip screens. That's from 1782. Here's where it gets dark. After the Civil War, American employers needed a way to avoid paying formerly enslaved workers a real wage. Tipping became that tool. George Pullman's railroad company hired newly freed black men as porters, paid them almost nothing, and told them their income would come from tips, from white passengers. By the 1920s, over 20,000 black men worked as Pullman porters, the largest category of black employment in America. By 1880, 43% of all hotel and restaurant workers in the country were black. By the early 1900s, 5 million American workers, more than 10% of the entire workforce, depended on tips for income. This wasn't an accident. This was a workaround, a way to technically end slavery without actually paying the people who used to be enslaved. People noticed, and they fought back. Washington banned tipping in 1909. 6 more states followed by 1915. Georgia called tips commercial bribes and made them illegal in 1918. By 1926, every single ban was overturned. And here's the detail that exposes what those bans were really about. 5 of the 6 states were in the South. The bans were mostly aimed at stopping white customers from tipping black workers, based on the idea, in their words, that you only tip inferiors. In 1925, Pullman porters unionized and demanded an end to tipping entirely. They lost. Then, in 1938, when the federal minimum wage was created, restaurant workers were excluded completely. In 1966, lawmakers allowed tips to cover half the minimum wage. In 1991, that tipped wage was set at $2.13. And in 1996, a new law permanently disconnected it from the minimum wage forever. That's the number we started with. It was fought for, defended, and locked in place. So why does this still work on you, every single time, at checkout? First reason, anchoring. When a screen shows 18, 20, and 25%, your brain doesn't ask what's fair. It asks, where do I land on this list? 20% suddenly feels responsible. Remove the 25, and that same 20 suddenly feels aggressive. When New York taxis added tip screens with 20, 25, and 30% buttons, average tips jumped from around 8 to 10% up to 22%. Nothing about the ride changed, only the numbers on the screen did. Second reason, the default effect. In one famous study on organ donation, consent rates ranged from 4% to 86% across countries, based on nothing but whether the form defaulted to yes or no. People take the path of least resistance. On a tip screen, 18, 20, and 25 are huge buttons. No tip is tiny text you have to hunt for. Third reason, guilt. You're often not tipping because you're grateful. You're tipping because not tipping, with someone watching, feels unbearable. 3 forces, all hitting you in about 3 seconds. None of them require you to be careless. They just require you to be human. None of this happened by accident. The National Restaurant Association is the group most responsible for keeping that $2.13 wage frozen. Their lobbying got the 1996 law passed. One labor group called it a watershed moment for the owner class. 30 years later, in 2025, they were still doing it, openly stating they successfully built support to preserve the tip credit. Same group, same goal, 3 decades apart. Meanwhile, companies like Square, Toast, and Clover designed your actual tip screen. 18, 20, 25% are big tappable buttons. Custom and no tip are buried. That's anchoring and the default effect, coded directly into the software by companies that profit from whichever button you tap. And in 2025, a new law let tipped workers deduct up to $25,000 in tip income from taxes. Sounds like a win, but notice what it doesn't touch. It doesn't raise the $2.13 wage. It doesn't touch the tip credit at all. A self-checkout kiosk at Newark Airport asked a Reuters reporter for a 15, 18, or 20% tip on a $22.72 total. That's up to $4.54 extra for a machine. She asked publicly, how do you tip a machine? Here's the part nobody tells you. A Lehigh University professor who studies tipping pointed out that federal laws requiring employers to pass tips to workers don't apply to machines. There is no guarantee that money goes to a human being at all. Some companies are just using how guilty people feel and turning that guilt directly into company revenue. Starbucks added tip prompts to grab-and-go coffee orders, where literally no one served you anything. The prompt isn't about the service anymore. The prompt is the product. So here's where this should all add up. Tip prompts are everywhere now. You'd assume workers are making more money than ever. They're not. In a 2024 survey of over 1,000 restaurant workers, only 29% said their tips went up over the past year. 36% said no change. 35% said tips went down. Payment data backs this up. Tipping percentages have stayed almost flat between 2023 and 2024. Some servers and bartenders even report earning up to 30% less than before, which they link to customers pushing back against all these new prompts. So look at the full shape of this. Tip prompts exploded. Public frustration exploded right alongside them. And the actual money landing in workers' pockets did not grow at all. Go back to that $17.04 paycheck. That number was never forgotten. It was protected. It was built deliberately after slavery as a way to avoid paying black workers directly. It survived bans in 6 states. It survived a union demanding its end. It was written into the first minimum wage law as an exclusion, then frozen permanently by a law shaped by industry lobbying. And once that wage was frozen, something else had to grow to cover the gap. That's why the tip screens exist. That's why they're built with anchoring, defaults, and guilt. 3 things that work on everyone. That's why they've spread to machines that have no worker behind them at all. The frozen wage and the exploding tip prompt aren't 2 separate stories. One side was locked in 1991 and never moved again. So the other side had to keep stretching, further into every screen you touch, just to fill a hole you were never supposed to be the one filling.